We have the lovely Norma-Jean McCreedy on the podcast today. I am so grateful for this connection. It happened very serendipitously. I met your lovely daughter, Bronwyn, at a friend's kind of child birthday party, and we got to talking, and she started telling me about you. And I was like, when is she getting on the podcast? So
Uh,
here you are. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
often of my activities back then, I don't think of them as being anything remarkable, but it's really nice to know that people are interested in hearing about it. There's a lot.
yeah, and I can't wait to dive in and
Okay.
hear about all the amazing things that
Okay.
you've done. And just so that the listeners know, I recorded the intro so they know some of your background, some of your education, but I also want them to understand what brought you to play such a pivotal role in the birth world in midwifery. So I'd love for you to share that.
Okay. Thank you. So there were a number of drop-in centers in Toronto. It sort of started there, and it starts in community. Yeah, I think that was one of the themes as I thought about this before our interview. The community that I was involved in Toronto at the time, this was the early 80s, there were a number of places to meet. And one of them was a place called the Children's Storefront in Toronto. And it was sort of the grandmother of a lot of the drop-in centers that grew out of that. And it was unique in that it was one of these places where people met and their children played around them, and we were able to sit at a kitchen table and share ideas and watch our children and socialize at the same time. And a number of us were having home births, and birth was definitely a big topic. Birth, natural child rearing, breastfeeding, the whole nine yards. And I had been involved, prior to this, I'd been involved in the Homebirth Task Force. There's so many antecedents to this. I sort of got ahead of myself. But the crux of it happened at a get together at the Children's Storefront, where the doctors who had been doing home births in Toronto were being harassed by the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And we were sitting around the table at the Children's Storefront, and I guess I can brag. I said, we have to do something about this. And there were a number of movers and shakers there. There was a number of very powerful women with a lot of skills in organizing, and very courageous women who spoke their minds, women who'd had, some of whom had had home births. And so we decided to have a gathering. There were about 5 of us, I think. Chief among them, only one whose name I remember, is a woman named Uta Mason, who is she was a wonderful Leche League leader. But anyway, we organized this gathering, and we held it at one of these big churches along Bloor Street in Toronto, and it was called Keeping Our Options Open. And we had hundreds of people show up, hundreds of women who were concerned about the persecution of the doctors who were carrying out home births. So there were midwives, lay midwives, who were coaching women through their births, through their pregnancies, and through childbirth. And the doctor would come in sort of at the last minute, kind of thing. The midwives would do the bulk of the monitoring of the birth, and then the doctors would come in. There was sort of a balance between the midwives and the doctors, but the doctors at that point were still very important. They sort of lent an air of legitimacy to the whole process. And so we had this big gathering, and out of it came this group called the Midwifery Task Force. And from then on, this must have been probably about 1983 or 84, maybe, something like that. And so what we would do was, whenever there was some sort of event, I can remember one event, I think it was at the University of Toronto, where we had people coming to speak. There were people coming from the US. There was this famous couple from a place called The Farm. I don't know if you've ever heard of The Farm. I think it was in Tennessee. And it was Stephen and Ina Mae Gaskin were the names of these 2 people. Anyway, they were the keynote speakers at this. And there were various groups that would have tables in the lobby outside where the speakers were happening, and we would have all our pamphlets ready, talking about the benefits of midwifery and how this task force had been set up. So there were various groups set up all around the province. I know there was one in Barrie eventually, which is where I live, but they were all over the province. And so we did that sort of thing for a number of years, all through the mid to late 80s and beyond. And eventually, I think in the background, the midwives themselves had formed an association, and they were lobbying the government, and they were working. But at the same time, we had this grassroots movement of mothers and fathers and anyone who cared, grandmothers, grandfathers, to educate people about midwifery, because there wasn't a lot of information about it. So, but to backtrack a little bit, I had been involved before the Midwifery Task Force. I was in something called the Homebirth Task Force in Toronto, and we used to hold information nights, and we showed movies. And this was after my older daughter, Bronwyn's older sister, was born, and I had attempted to have a home birth with her. So I had a midwife, a wonderful woman named Judy Pustel, who passed away many years ago, unfortunately, but she was a lay midwife in Toronto, one of a number of lay midwives who had wonderful reputations, that had great connections with some of the doctors. There were 3 or 4 doctors, a Dr. McCullough and a Dr. Lukasic. Anyway, I wasn't successful having a home birth that time. I was not quite prepared, let's say, but even after that, I was still sold on the idea of home birth. My labor wasn't progressing. I wasn't in any kind of danger with the childbirth, but I wasn't progressing. So I went to hospital, and I managed to give birth vaginally, for which I was grateful. But that experience really galvanized me. It was quite traumatizing in many, many ways. Being in the hospital, I found very traumatizing. You lose your control. And there was a lot of antipathy towards the doctor, Dr. Lukasic. There was a lot of hostility towards him. The staff that were coming in were bad-mouthing him to me. Here I was, a laboring mom, and I'd been in labor for more than 24 hours at this point, and finally opted to have an epidural, which I swore I would never do. And in the end, I did have a good vaginal delivery, but then my baby was taken from me. They said she was cold. I spent the whole night without my new baby. Gave birth sort of late afternoon, and my husband had to go home. He cried all the way home. I think that is a real tragedy. I think for him, it was tragic. And so she was isolated from us. And so I didn't have that skin to skin contact. This was 1981. So it was a typical experience. It wasn't unusual at all. And so after that, I had a very difficult time coming to terms with the sense of failure as a woman and as a mother, because I had such high hopes for the birth. I knew I had learned so much, and I knew what the benefits were of the close bonding, and I didn't get to have that, and I was devastated. And it took me years to recover from that, years and years. And we struggled with breastfeeding problems, and I started going to La Leche League meetings, which is another thread in this story. These groups, the Children's Storefront, the Drop-In Center, the Midwifery and Homebirth Task Forces, where I met women and shared stories, and we supported one another. And La Leche League was a very, very big part of that. And I joined La Leche League, started going to meetings. There was a wonderful group of women in the downtown Toronto La Leche League group in the early 80s. And I got tremendous support from them. And I was in training to become a leader, but I never managed to do it. I was just too busy with babies. I'm eternally grateful to the women that helped me. If there was a problem, a breastfeeding problem, I had it. I had every last problem that you could possibly think of. A problem with latching and abscesses and infections and bleeding nipples and failure to let down failure, and just like everything. But I managed to continue. Even at one point, after about 6 weeks, one of my midwives associates, a woman, wonderful, wonderful woman, legendary, really. Her name is Mary Sharp. She said, well, you know, Norma-Jean, some women just aren't meant to breastfeed. And I wasn't ready to give up. I wasn't ready to give up. I mean, even though I'd had every problem. And finally, around 6 weeks, a breakthrough happened. And you can't underestimate the power of these things. They sound sort of small and trivial, but it wasn't at the time. I learned how to nurse lying down. And I was finally able to get some sleep. And that was a turning point. And all of a sudden, I felt competent. And I started to sort of regain my confidence in my ability to mother my baby, because the experience in the hospital had been so alienating that I really lost confidence in myself and was feeling like a complete failure. And of course, you're going through all of this hormonal stuff. So around six or 7 weeks, everything started to come together. And for the next year, it was just a breeze. The mothering experience, the breastfeeding experience, the involvement in the community, it was like a miracle, you know. And I feel for young women now, young mothers now who don't have that, because that's what got me through, you know. And I became successful. And then when I had my daughter, my younger daughter, Bronwyn, who we met 6 years later, it was my chance to redeem myself. I felt it was my chance to redeem myself and to prove to myself that I could set out to do this and do it. And I had a few issues. There was a bit of an issue with some leaking. So I was leaking a little bit for a couple of days. And if I had been going to an obstetrician, they were monitoring, the midwives were monitoring. Again, I had midwives. They were monitoring me very carefully, but it was a bit tense for a couple of days. But I managed to give birth successfully in half the time. In this case, it was only about 20 hours instead of 40. Yeah, and without any medication and with wonderful midwives. And the doctor came not for the birth at that point. Midwifery still wasn't legalized, but the doctor only came to check after the birth, a day, maybe the next day. And I can still remember shouting after I gave birth. I can remember shouting, "I did it!" very, very loudly, to the point where my next door neighbor, because we lived in a semi in Toronto, she said, "Yes, I heard you." But have heard me laboring. You can't really hide very much when you're that loud and you're in a semi. I did have breastfeeding issues during my second postpartum period, and some of them were quite serious. But again, I got a lot of support from the Leche League, from my friends, from the leaders, from the community that I had built around this whole birthing process. It was a very strong community. So I managed to get through that. And when my first two were planned, and the third one was a surprise. Because sometimes, you know, kids will tease one another and they'll say, "Oh, you were a mistake." But I like to say that he was a surprise, and a wonderful surprise. So it was over 2 years later, I gave birth a third time and cut my time in labor in half again. And he had very, very gentle birth, a beautiful entry into the world. And I was so grateful and felt so empowered. And again, I stayed tuned into all of these support groups, but especially La Leche League. So, I mean, all of it was tied together under the umbrella of all things natural, I guess is the best way to describe it, because I had been sort of looking at alternatives to modern medical treatment, questioning all of this. In the Leche League, I was the librarian, and we had a fantastic library of books. And back in the day, we didn't have the internet, so we just read all the books that we could get our hands on. And the Leche League has its own personal or its own special brand. And it was a little different back then. It was more hippy dippy then than it is now. But for want of a better word, my girls like to tease me, "You know, you were such a hippie, Mom." mom. And now one of my daughters is in some sort of chat group called Hippie Mamas, which I think is so funny anyway.
Yeah, it's cool, right?
Oh, very
The,
cool. Very
the
cool.
thing they made fun of you for is now what's
They,
cool.
affectionately. And they will often say, I wish I was bringing my kids up in the 80s, Mom, because life was simpler. And back in those days, it was more acceptable to question a lot of different things. The typical medical practices, the epidural and the shaving and the enema and taking the baby away right after birth and not delaying cord clamping and everything that went along with that was
Can you unpack that a little more? Because I don't have personal experience from what happened in the 70s and 80s.
right.
And
Right.
I'd love to know what the terrain was that you were navigating as an expectant mom and a mom for a second and third time, and what that was like for you, what the norm was, what the
Right.
routines were,
Right.
and what led you to question.
Right. I think I was primed to question prior to, because one of my husband's cousins had given birth at home. And also at the end of I was at university at the time, just in the year before I got pregnant. And I took a women's health class and I wrote a paper about home birth. So I looked into the statistics and I knew what some of the pitfalls were about giving birth in hospital. And I knew from the studying that I had done that, all things considered, with comparable groups, that the safety record of home birth and hospital birth, it was pretty much the same, except that there were more adverse events in hospital. There were more complications in hospital than at home, but the mortality rate and the morbidity rate was pretty much the same, which sort of went against what the received wisdom would have been at the time, and probably still is. So what I was up against was being in hospital, so being in a foreign environment, not your own environment, where you're not in control, and just the medicalization of birth, a woman on her back, on a table, at the mercy of the doctors, basically taking orders, and all of the various protocols that they had. At that point in time, I think they were still shavings, a woman's perineum, episiotomies were sort of the norm, as well as forceps and vacuum extraction. And I think that they were probably still administering enemas, but at that point, but because I was a transport from home, they didn't do any of that. But the medicalization of birth and the lack of sensitivity towards women once the baby is born, the whole process of birth, where that sacred time after the baby emerges and is placed on your chest, we were allowed about half an hour. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, it seems shocking now because it's so different, even in hospital. But at that point in time, that was the norm. Oh, well, we've got to take her now. We've got to take her temperature. Oh, she's cold. We got to put her in an incubator. And they took, I think she was born at 6:30, and by 7:30, I was back in the ward and by myself in a room by myself. My husband had left. My baby was somewhere. I didn't know where. And they brought her to me, I think at 9-ish, but my husband had, as I said before, had gone home, and he said he cried all the way home. He was a very sensitive guy and a wonderful support. And then the next day, we wanted to leave. And this was sacrilege at that point. It was absolute sacrilege to leave the next day. And we were accused of child abuse.
Oh, man.
For wanting to leave. And this was about, well, she'd been born at 6:30. This was about 12 to 14 hours after the birth. And of course, now babies, as long as the mother and baby are fine, they send you home after 2 to 4 hours. I know, and that's a long window. So we had to fight all day to get out of there. So by the time we got out, I had started labor on a Friday night, and this was Sunday night, and that she was born, and we fought all Monday. By the time we got home with our baby, I was practically psychotic from lack of sleep. And I had a terrible time initially because I couldn't handle everything I had been through. It was so traumatizing. They were giving me grief because my baby was O positive and I was O negative. So I'd already had RhoGAM shots while I was pregnant, and it doesn't even become an issue until your second child anyway. But they were giving me grief over this. We finally got home, and so it took me months, and I did suffer some mild postpartum depression. But as I said before, when I was able to finally get some good rest and felt confident in meeting my baby's needs, then I turned things around, and it became the joy that I had hoped it would be. And I reveled in it, loved it, and tapped into this community like you wouldn't believe. And the Midwifery Task Force started sometime around then. I'm trying to remember when we had this plenary session, but I wish I had saved some of that stuff. You know how you throw things out and you wish you had?
Mhm. All
Yeah,
the pamphlets and
all the
all the things.
they
Yes, yes.
were, I had no idea.
Yeah.
So excuse me, when it was, I worked on the Midwifery Task Force until we left Toronto in 1990. And by the time I moved up to here to Barrie in 1990, things had started to move. I think they were inching towards legalizing it. And there were other people that sort of took up the challenge. And I have a very good friend here in Barrie. She used to live in Barrie, and she became part of a midwifery task force group here in Barrie. So I forget where I was going with this. You'll have
Well,
to.
I'd love to pause right here just to, first of all, celebrate your dedication and devotion to that mother-baby bond that you were fostering. And I think if listeners can take anything away, it is creating the community that can support you during this process is so
Mhm,
foundational.
mhm,
The fact that you had access to the Leche League and had access to that library, all the information, and the women that were constantly supporting you, cheering you on, brainstorming with you, troubleshooting with you,
mhm,
so that you could get to a place where you finally are able to feel competent in offering your baby what it needs, and
mhm,
therefore beginning to really enjoy motherhood. And I do also just want to go back and I'm so sorry that you experienced what you experienced, because after giving birth is when actually our oxytocin levels are higher than they are in labor, on
mhm,
purpose to create that intense bond and to support breastfeeding.
mhm,
And now, yes, skin to skin has become routine. And
mhm.
back then it wasn't a thing. We didn't really know about it. We didn't honor it very well.
Yeah.
It wasn't routine. It wasn't policy in hospitals. And so I just think of the thousands of mothers, thousands of families that experienced what you experienced
Mhm.
just because it wasn't a priority. It wasn't, in the mindset of the staff. And I am curious, when you said that people, like the staff, was bad mouthing the doctor, was it the home birth doctor that
Yes, yes.
was oh, okay? And like you had transferred with that doctor to the
I had,
hospital?
yes, and he had never even he never even came to the house because I
Mhm.
wasn't progressing. He would have showed up if I had come, if my labor had been progressing. So he was there, and he was very good, and he was
Mhm.
very protective of me.
Mm.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
And I think the tide is shifting now as well, but the language that we use around labor and like the failure success language,
Mhm,
that dichotomy is shifting. Like there is no such thing as failure, like failure with breastfeeding or failure in labor and birth. There is no such thing. It is birth. And I think that finally that language is shifting, because so many mothers are internalizing like quote unquote failure, because it's like
yes,
failure to progress. But
right.
oftentimes that's not what it is. It's just your labor is very different than someone else's. You might
Mhm,
have needed
mhm,
support in different ways than someone else. So I'm glad that the tide has shifted with skin to skin, with
mhm.
some of that language as
And
well.
delayed cord clamping is a big one, a really big one.
Yes, let's dive into that as
Yeah,
well.
and that was something. Excuse me. when my oldest daughter, she was the first one of my children to give birth, and when she was pregnant, I started talking to her about things like delayed cord clamping and the vitamin K shot and vaccines in general, because so I was able, there was another theme that I thought was important, was supporting not only people coming up through the ranks or through the new moms coming after my own trials and my own triumphs. I was then able eventually, because I did act as sort of a de facto Leche League leader for a while, even though I didn't have my qualifications. And then with my own children, I started talking about some of the things that I had learned about, things that I had questioned, things that had been shared with the groups of women that I was part of. And one of them was the huge issue of just natural breastfeeding on demand, family bed, baby-led weaning, and the whole topic of nutrition and also of vaccines. There were people in my Leche League group. One of the leaders one of her children had a very severe reaction to vaccines, and she looked into it and tapped into a whole motherload of information that was out there, and it was definitely out there. There was a magazine at that time called Mothering, which was like a Bible to a lot of us. And there were all kinds of doctors in there. Chief among them was a guy named Robert Mendelsohn, Dr. Robert Mendelsohn. He was in Chicago, and I think he was affiliated with La Leche League. And he wrote a book called How to Raise a Healthy Child in Spite of Your Doctor. And so I thought, I just gobbled that up. I just had a predisposition, let's put it that way. I had a predisposition to question everything. And at that point in time, it was acceptable. It was acceptable to question vaccines. It was acceptable to question traditional, or not traditional, but hospital birth practices. It was not, you weren't labeled as a weirdo or a conspiracy theorist or an anti-science. People might have thought, oh, well, you're endangering your baby, but they weren't threatened by it, and you weren't labeled and dropped into a pile somewhere, a pile of unacceptable people with unacceptable views. And so that was another function of the community, the community where we supported one another, and we lobbied. We went to demonstrations at Queen's Park, lobbying against vaccine mandates. And with my first child, I did vaccinate her the first round of vaccines, and I wasn't happy about it. And then I pretty much stopped. And with my other two, that was something that I just didn't do. And they turned out to be healthy children, no antibiotics in infancy or even in early childhood. And so it was very empowering to be around other women and other parents, because the men were involved too. The men were supportive, and in an atmosphere of acceptance, which is completely absent now. No, it's a completely different environment now than it was back then.
Yeah. How healthy to just feel like you can question without being afraid of being ostracized just for questioning.
Yes. And
what a healthy environment that must have been.
I hesitate to bring it up in most company. I'm very reluctant to bring it up, but I never regretted my decision, because I feel like I did the best I could to give my children the best beginning. And I made mistakes. We all stumble, and some of my mistakes were pretty big, but I kept trying to get through all the challenges with the help, with the support of the community. It was harder up in Barrie, though. Nothing against Barrie, but it's a smaller city. In Toronto, there were so many like-minded people that I'm grateful now for having had that support. So in the end, I was going through some of my old papers, and in the end, I came across, this is a letter to the editor that I wrote to the Toronto Star in January of 1994, because there was a big hoopla about midwifery being legalized. And there were a lot of naysayers. And so I wrote a letter to the editor extolling the virtues of midwifery and comparing them to hospital or the medical model, basically, that midwives, you get the most continuity of care, and the outcomes are pretty much the same, but women are supported right through pregnancy, right through labor and postpartum, with the same team of midwives. Whereas with a doctor, you get very little time. The doctor doesn't really get to know you. You may get an associate. They're not there for you. You're passed off to someone else. So I remember I wrote this letter, and it was, the Toronto Star had every Saturday would have this big page of letters to the editor, and at the top was the sort of the most prominent letter was this that I had written, and I thought it was pretty good, you know. And what do I know? And then I had people coming back at me with all sorts of snide remarks. So even then, there was a lot of opposition to midwifery. There were a lot of people in the general public, as well as in the medical profession. A lot of midwives, I think, suffered a lot of sabotage, possibly, I guess you could say, from what I heard in hospitals. Yeah, and I'm to this day, I think a lot of women who have midwives actually give birth in birthing centers, but I think that's a great thing because there are so many options now that you can have almost the same experience in hospital with all of the good parts that you get at home, with the operating theater just down the hall, basically. But you're in this cocoon, and my daughters gave birth in birthing centers. And actually, my older daughter, I'd given birth at Toronto East General, and it's now called Michael Guerin, but she gave birth to all three of her children in the birthing center there. And my other daughter gave birth in Richmond Hill in a birthing center with a midwife. So
beautiful.
I was so grateful that I was able to support them through that. Yeah.
Yeah, how lovely, all your experience coming
That
into the
experience.
birth of your grandchildren.
And then postpartum, the community rallies, and
Mhm.
I'm an Amma, my Icelandic, and I'm an Amma. Amma the rescue whenever she was useful. And I reveled in that. I mean, it's such a wonderful journey to go from being the person who's never given birth, looking at women who've just given birth and trying to absorb it all, and then continuing on through your own journey, going through your struggles, finding help, building community, and then going on to support other women, and then eventually to support your own daughters through childbirth and postpartum. And yeah, it's a great adventure. It's a great adventure.
So beautiful. And truly that is, I want to say, like a definition of wealth, right? Like your daughters were able to benefit from that legacy, from your
Mhm.
devotion to motherhood in general, and they were able to receive that. And that is lacking so much, unfortunately, right now, just because of, you know, how far away families live from each other, just the way that society functions, that, you know, we don't have the grandmother coming to help. We don't have a lot of the aunts and the cousins coming to help a lot of the time. And so mothers are feeling the weight of postpartum on their own a lot of the time, leading to higher rates of postpartum anxiety and depression, not even
Mhm.
taking into consideration what had happened in the birth itself.
Mhm. Mhm.
And going back to your first birth story, when you had, you know, a very challenging first 6 weeks, that first 40-day window,
Mhm.
the fourth trimester, in a lot of ways, we also aren't really honoring that. And so when there is something to heal from, when there is a traumatic event in birth,
Mhm.
that 40-day window is meant to heal and recover from whatever might have happened. Even if it went
Mhm.
really smoothly, you're still healing from a big
Mhm.
event.
For sure. For
And
sure.
so I think your story just emphasizes how important it is to have community within the first 40 days and beyond.
Mhm.
So I just want listeners to let that sink in. Like, no matter what happens in your birth experience, you need to be surrounded by community and support systems in the first 40 days to be able to recover from all the things you can't control.
And you can heal. You can heal. Devastated. And I healed from that. I did heal from that. Thanks to the support and my willingness to tap into it. And I was grateful. I think that there was a bit of a schism between my mother's generation, who listened to Dr. Spock, and they had an even more alienating experience than I did. And it was unfortunate because I didn't feel supported because my mother had had such a different experience with childbirth. I wasn't breastfed, and there were so many misconceptions about the type of mothering, the type of childbirth and mothering experience that I was going for. And so I'm grateful that between me and my daughters, we were more in sync with one another about the childbirth experience, about the skin to skin contact, about the sort of taking your cues from your baby kind of response, rather than, for instance, letting the baby cry it out, because that was still a thing, and it's still a thing now, but it was when I was growing up, that was the norm. You just put your baby in the crib and you left them, and you prop their bottle up on a little rolled up blanket and let them feed themselves. And so I'm grateful that things have changed at least that much, and that much healing can happen, and each successive generation hopefully can heal more and experience more of what nature intended for us as mothers and as families and as fathers. I mean, the home birth experience was so much more empowering for my husband. And I'm sure it was much more empowering for my sons-in-law, giving birth, having their wives give birth in a birthing center where their role was welcomed and valued. And they were part of the team. They weren't shut out, the way my father and my parents' generation would have been. So it's very slow, but it's a very slow process. Very.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up the father's perspective, because we often don't talk about that on the podcast. But someone on the podcast had said that the first father who was allowed to stay to support his wife in labor had to handcuff himself to the hospital bed. And that's what had shifted the perspective. The nurses were like, well, yeah, like, I guess he could stay. He's here. And it kind of got the ball rolling from there to at least have the acceptance of their presence in the room. And so it has gone, I wonder where the pendulum had shifted, because clearly, over a century ago, things were more based on our instincts and working with nature, because that's what we were working with. And I wonder where the pendulum shifted to this very isolating experience where, the baby was taken away, the fathers weren't allowed, to witness. And then slowly we're like healing and recovering from all of these policies that were implemented. And it is beautiful to see that in a couple of generations that we're coming back around, and that it's routine in hospitals to support skin to skin. We're moving in the right direction little by little, but there's like the inertia of it. It is such a slow process that families are forced to find alternatives, essentially, until the system catches up.
Yes.
Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yes. And well, I certainly saw it, the difference between giving birth, for me, giving birth in hospital at that point in time, and the experience I had at home was like night and day. I was so elated after the birth of my second and third. I mean, I was elated after the birth of my first child, but it was dampened. So that having that choice, I had no hesitation about making that choice, because there weren't viable options. Now there are more viable options in a hospital, but at that point in time, there weren't. And so I was so grateful for the community of midwives, and it was still kind of a dicey situation with the midwives. They weren't exactly outlaws, but we held them in such reverence. These women, they were just stellar, so compassionate, so wise, so kind, so gentle, and so courageous. I still think of them with awe, Catherine Pence and Mary Sharp and Judy Postel and some of the other pioneers. I can't remember their names at the moment, but they were all instrumental in pioneering midwifery in Ontario, and they set up the curriculum. And yeah, I do think though that there is a slight shift now, and I've heard that some midwives are sometimes called medwives now.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's unfortunate. It's one of the prices you pay for becoming part of a system that they would have fought against before, fought against
Mm-hmm.
the protocols of, and yet in order to be part of that, you have to make concessions. And so I think they became much more medicalized, and birth has to a certain extent become more medicalized. I think from what I see, the number of tests and the stress that pregnant mothers go through, I think was much higher. It has become much higher than what we went through. There was very little, and it was very much that sort of hippy dippy time, in the early 80s. It was just, I mean, we were just out of the 70s, and counterculture was still pretty strong. So,
Yeah.
but it's reemerging. I think that counterculture is reemerging, and we're all hungering for alternatives. We want to have that agency. We want to have that control over our health decisions. We want to research about childbirth practices and medical practices. We want to have a say, and we want informed choice.
Yeah.
And I think people have that power and are exercising it, and I'm really heartened by that. I'm very encouraged by the strength and the resilience of the women that I meet through my daughters, the mothers that my own daughters are connected with. It's wonderful to see that same process is continuing. And
Truly.
no reason why it shouldn't, I mean,
Yeah.
I did my best. To set an example, despite some of my stumbles. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
They come
parenthood.
more when they're older.
They come around, right?
Oh,
I
they come
think
around, yes.
I think the life cycle is they're a child, and so you have a lot of influence. And then in teenhood, it's I think a part of our human development to question and to rebel
Mhm,
against and to
mhm.
want to forge our own path. And then we come around eventually, and we
Yes.
see that from our own personal experience, based on what our parents are offering us, that like, yeah, okay, they weren't
Mhm,
wrong. Yeah.
mhm,
And that's a beautiful thing. But I do want to go back to the legalization of midwifery. And
mhm.
so, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, all the lay midwives were became legal. So they were kind of
Yes,
like
grandmothered in.
grandmothered into
I
this
believe that's the term they use.
system. But just to reiterate what you said, in order to be a part of this system, they had to make some shifts to how they cared for pregnant women,
Yes.
and certain tests and certain regulations were put in place. And so, and that's fine. But I think why some might be labeling them as midwives now is because the parameters of who they can care for is now much smaller. High risk has become,
Mhm.
something that they can't really participate in.
Right.
And the definition of high risk keeps, like, the umbrella just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Surprised me. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think there's just this kind of push pull dynamic that's happening right now in the world of birth, where women, mothers, families are really feeling the pull towards bodily autonomy, and who
Mhm,
can support them in what they desire is now
mhm,
the question. It's not this is what the doctor says, so I'm going to listen. It is now this is what I desire. Who's going to support me in that? So it's coming back to, I think, personal power now, personal autonomy, and
mhm,
how can I support my family the most for those families who question things, who are curious, who
mhm,
want to just, forge the path for their children and the next generation that feels most aligned for them.
mhm,
And there's a lot of families that feel very comfortable going to the hospital because that's where they feel the safest, and that's okay too. But
yeah.
we can get into a lot of, kind of controversial topics in that realm as well. A lot of families, I think, go into the experience, especially young mothers, not really knowing what to expect, not knowing what questions to ask, not knowing what routine policies are
Mhm.
routine procedures are going to take place, and what the benefits and risks are of those things on them
Mhm.
and their baby. So I think that's why these conversations are so important, just to flush out what takes place, why
Mhm.
it takes place, and
Right.
how this impacts you and your baby in the postpartum period.
And a lot of it is not openly discussed in the same way that it might have been at one time. I could be wrong about that, but a lot of new moms go into it and they don't really have any frames of reference. They might have heard a few people, but talking about their experience. But now that people who question orthodox medical treatments are being so deeply demonized and marginalized, I think it does a disservice to new moms, because then they don't hear the whole story. They don't hear about the research. They don't allow themselves to question that the doctor knows everything, and don't question the doctor, because to question the doctor means that you're questioning the science,
Mhm.
which is open to question. It can be bought and paid for, and there's plenty of
Mhm.
evidence to suggest that much of it is. And so a lot of people don't allow themselves that, because of the atmosphere, today's atmosphere of demonizing anyone who questions, particularly medical dogma, nutritional dogma, all of the other dogmas. We're just not allowed to question, and it's really unfortunate. It's a very kind of tense time, I think, for a lot of people, and it makes new parents vulnerable, very vulnerable, because they're already apprehensive. It's a new experience, and there's everything is so fraught. Every decision is so fraught with. They're told that this is dangerous, that's dangerous. You have to worry about this. You have to worry about that. You have to have this ultrasound and that ultrasound. I think I only had one ultrasound in all three of my pregnancies. I'm not even sure. I think I did have one, but back in that period of time, it wasn't considered essential. And like, I didn't have the glucose tolerance test. They would check my blood pressure and my urine and things like that. But that's how different it was. That's how different it was. And
Mhm.
part of it is changing times. So the midwives' roles and the amount of medicalization that the midwives have had to be drawn into has changed over time, because of the whole atmosphere around childbirth in general, not just home birth versus hospital birth. It's just changed a lot. It's changed a lot. So I feel for these new parents, people coming into it for the first time. I really feel for them.
Mhm.
It's not an
Yeah.
easy area. It's not an easy terrain to go through.
I agree. I agree. And I can see, so often I'll go and I'll talk to expectant parents, and I see the heaviness
Yeah.
that is with them, because they're overwhelmed with all the things, and especially the stuff you have to get.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you feel like you have to get so many items for this tiny human that's coming into the world, and you don't want to be stuck at 2 in the morning without those items that you are being, constantly told are necessary for you to enjoy your motherhood journey, your
Mhm.
your fatherhood journey. And it puts the overwhelm over the edge when you're then faced with all of these medical decisions that can have profound impacts on your experience. And so
Yes.
sometimes getting more feels reassuring, but
Mhm.
can then lead to potentially more investigation and more testing and more intervention.
Mhm.
Even though that was what was supposed to give you reassurance, it's actually creating more anxiety and more overwhelm.
Point. That's a very good point.
So
I'm
it's tricky
astounded.
terrain.
Yeah, I'm astounded at the amount of equipment that was necessary, and all of it was used, and it was all lovely and very reassuring. And I don't begrudge them any, the kids, any of it. And of course, my wonderful grandchildren deserved every last little thing.
Yeah.
Um, but like, I had, for my babies, and this was the norm. It's not like I was an outlier. Secondhand clothes. I didn't have a crib. I never had a crib. The only thing I had was a Snuggly. And I had a few other iterations along the way of Snugglies and then something else and something else that was similar, and a change table. Change table.
Mm.
Change
Mhm.
table, and we had a diaper service. That was a whole story in itself.
Did you use cloth diapers?
For a while. For a
Yeah.
while. Yeah, I did actually. For the most part, I did for a long time. And of course, disposable diapers were not that great at that point anyway.
Yeah.
I did cloth diapers for a long time, but I think it sort of distorts the baby's physiology, because they're so bulky. Going off on a tangent there, but yeah, I had very little equipment. I'm trying to think. I can't
Mhm.
much beyond that. A lot of secondhand clothes.
Yeah, it's kind of bananas now what you
Yeah.
are marketed that is essential for your baby. And
Mhm.
so I think, the message for the listeners is get back to basics. What do you need? Like this woman in front of you speaking right now who's had 3 children and also has grandchildren is telling you she didn't even have a crib. So
Yeah.
what do we actually need for our babies? Did you co-sleep? Is that why you didn't have a crib?
Yes, I was determined to do that. It just made sense to me, and life was much, much easier. I didn't have to get up in the night. And
Mhm.
eventually I had a piece of foam, I had a mattress on the floor, and someone lent me a cradle, but I didn't really use it very much. And my babies were in arms a lot and early on, very early on in arms. It was sort of
Yeah.
front end effort, an effort at the beginning, and they were all lovely, self sufficient, independent people, very,
Mhm.
very fine people, very successful, all in their own rights.
Yeah. I
So
can second that after meeting your daughter. She's so lovely,
she
like
is,
such a beautiful human.
she's awesome.
So you did really well
Oh,
from, meeting one of your children. And that's something else I want people to take in as well. Like so much of the messaging that we get is that you are like spoiling your baby, that you're babying your baby, that
yeah.
you're creating these negative or bad habits, quote unquote, that are making your baby feel extra attached to you. But the research continues to show that babying your baby, quote unquote, if that's a real thing that you can do,
Mhm,
allows them to develop in a way where they have that secure attachment to
mhm,
you. And then they don't need to get these unmet needs met as adults and act like babies when they are adults. They get
mhm,
to be a baby when they're a baby, and then they get to move through the rest of their developmental arc.
mhm,
And the other thing that I will say about that is because, as you mentioned, there is so much tension in this space where you get labeled and you get put into a camp as soon as you question something or make a certain decision. And so what I see in this space is the natural mom camp and let's say the camp that doesn't really care that much. That's more the camp of like, oh, you just like do what everyone else does. You just go to the hospital, you get an epidural, boom, bam, done.
yeah,
I'm just going to do what everyone else does. And even within those camps, there can be negativity towards people who don't make the same decisions. Maybe it doesn't feel right for you and your family to co-sleep, even though that was right for you with maybe your first child, but it doesn't feel right for you with your second child, and that's
right.
okay.
Okay.
I
It's a
think,
choice. It's a choice.
yeah, and I think I
Choice.
just want to urge mothers and families to do what's best for their mental health because there is so much energy that
Mhm,
goes into having that very secure attachment, and you can have it, and it doesn't always have to be the mother carrying the baby, for example. There
no,
can be lots of loving, trustworthy grown-ups
right,
around supporting the mother who are also, the hands on this beautiful child. And
right.
so I think I want to just give anyone listening permission to do what's right for them because in a space that is so fraught with tension and strong opinions, I think what smooths that all out is just using our intuition. What does
Mhm,
my intuition say? What does my internal authority guide me to do in this circumstance, in this decision that I have to make? What feels good in my body for
right.
me? And that's a skill that's learned, and I think that's a part of what's going to solve so much of the tension in this space, because it
Right.
doesn't need to be a polarized space. It
No, it doesn't
doesn't,
be.
yeah.
And to do to keep your sanity in the situation. If you have to leave the house for a few hours and leave a crying newborn, sometimes that's what you have to do. You know, if
Mhm.
you need whatever you need to do to be the best mother you can be, and the best parent you can be, because there are no
Yeah.
hard and fast rules, but it should be a choice. It should be a choice, and we shouldn't be frightened into having to follow a certain path because of some study that may or may not have taken everything into consideration.
Yeah.
There's ample evidence for all kinds of different practices.
Hmm.
So I think we should all have choices. Parents should all have choices. And
Yeah.
I like the idea of people feeling guilty. I suffered from that enough myself initially. I felt so guilty about my performance, giving birth to my first child. I just felt this terrible sense of inadequacy. And I would hate for any mother to feel that about any aspect of their mothering, any parent to feel that about any aspect of their parenting. You do what you need to do, without guilt, as long as, as long as you're keeping your baby's needs first and foremost, without neglecting yourself. One of the pieces of advice, whenever I go to a shower and they ask for advice for the new mother, I always say, trust your baby. Your baby is perfectly designed to tell you what he or she needs. And if you can't trust your baby, who can you trust? So that's my advice to mom. Trust your baby. I mean, you obviously you have to look after yourself first and foremost, or you can't look after your baby. But as a guiding principle, I think that's something that's missing. We're taught, there's this insidious message that we should not be trusting what the baby is telling us, because if we are, they're manipulating us. Well, they have no context, they have no frames of reference. They're not manipulating you. They're just behaving the way a normal newborn will behave when their needs aren't being met, and they're going to let you know. They don't have a filter. They're not manipulating.
Mhm.
So that's sort of one of my guiding principles. I did my best. I did my best.
Yeah, I love that. If you can't trust your baby, who can you trust?
I mean, really,
That's so rich. I love that. And yeah, again, like honing into your intuition, honing into your inner authority, but it also assumes that people have support. And so I would
yes,
say, above all else, like try, if you don't have friends and family around, if you live, you had to move away from everyone, just do your best to kind of foster support through different programs like the Leche League, or
mhm,
different mother groups or parent groups, or anything that will be supportive for you, because that can be a lifeline for so many parents on this journey where you feel like, I can't do this. I've
right.
made a big mistake. My whole life is
Oh,
different.
yeah.
Who
Oh, yeah.
am I even? Like my body's
Yeah.
changed. All of these things are
Yes.
changed. The
Yes.
community can be such a lifeline. So also making that a priority.
Yes.
So, Norma, as my last question,
Mhm.
there is such a profound imprint that takes place when a new life is entering this reality. And often that imprint can be one of love and safety and trust, this like big welcome party for this baby that's coming into the world. And those are all signatures of oxytocin.
Mhm.
And that's working with our human physiology. Sometimes what happens is the imprint, for whatever reason, is a fear of unsafety, of mistrust, of survival mode. And that's okay. That's not permanent. We can do things to heal that. But from what I see as a naturopath, like why would we repair when we can prepare and support each other? And that's a big mission of this podcast. And also we carry these imprints in our bones, in our cells for the rest of our life. And so
Mhm.
if enough women, if enough mothers, enough families are supported moving through this experience,
Mhm.
we can shift the world in a single generation, one or two generations, because then
Mhm.
there's going to be a lot of humans moving through this world, feeling at their essence that they are loved, that they are safe, that they can trust the environment that they've been born into. And I think that
Mhm.
can have such immense ripple effects on the
Yeah,
world.
I
So that's
agree.
why this work is so important. And I know that you feel that, and so many people that come on to this podcast feel that. And so, with that being said, that's all just my way of asking you, what would you like to imprint onto the ears of the listeners? It's a lot of
My
new
goodness,
moms.
give yourself permission to fumble it a bit. Babies are resilient, but as long as you keep in mind that your baby is perfectly programmed to tell you what he or she needs, and that you also that you have the right to make your own choices, and it's very valuable to look at alternative ways of giving birth, child rearing, medical treatment. It's okay to question any of that. It's your right as a human. You want to do the best by your child. You want the best experience that you can have to fulfill your role as a woman, as a father, as a mother. And you can give yourself that permission. We all have that agency. We can all do that. It's our right. It's our right to do that.
Beautiful. Trust your curiosity is what I'm hearing.
Yes, curiosity is absolutely key. I'm involved in a grief support group. I lost my husband a number of years ago and recently lost
Mm.
my boyfriend of 4 years. And I'm in a grief support group. And we were asked to hone in on what our values were. And my one chief among my values was learning and curiosity. And I've always been curious. And I think that we have been told that we shouldn't be curious anymore, that we should just accept. And I think that's one of the themes of my life, is that I don't just accept what I'm being told. I question it. I'm skeptical. I'm very skeptical in general, but personally, I'm not. I'm much more open, probably more open than I should be. But in general, just curiosity and learning are absolutely primary values, I think. Yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely. And it carries you through whatever experiences you
Yes,
have.
it does.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for those wise words, Norma-Jean. Thank you for sharing your experience. You are such a trailblazer. Oh my goodness.
We didn't know. Yeah.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
were just doing what we did. Yeah.
Yeah, and you even connected with Ina May Gaskin, which is she's
Really?
also a huge she's passed now, but she
Yes,
was a massive trailblazer in this
she
space.
was. She wrote books, and her husband was there. And I have to tell you this one little story. So Stephen Gaskin, he was her husband. He told the story of what to do when you're out in public and your baby wants to nurse, and what you do, and there are people around you who don't want you to have that right to discreetly feed your baby in public, to breastfeed your baby. He said, take a bunch of those lunch bags, lunch bags, and just hand them out and say, if you don't like it, here's a bag, you can put it over your head. That was from Stephen Gaskin from the farm. I was
Yeah.
said that at one of these gatherings where we were handing out our pamphlets. Yeah, they were a big draw at that gathering.
Yes,
That
yes.
was funny.
I love that.
I, uh,
Thank you for sharing. Norma-Jean, if people want to get in touch with you, let's say they have questions about things that you've shared, if they're just curious, is there a way that they can email you or get in touch with
yeah,
you?
email me. Sure, sure.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll put your email in the show notes so that they can do that if they're curious. And we are
yeah.
very much supporting curiosity on this episode. And just to say thank you again. Thank you for just being so devoted to curiosity, to alternatives, to following where that curiosity was leading you, and to forming all of these amazing, beautiful community connections and being a part of the transition that we are seeing in the birth world of people wanting
Mhm.
more agency, advocating for themselves and for their families. And I'm excited to continue to see where it leads.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. It's wonderful. I'm thrilled. I was so pleased to hear that you were out there and you were doing this. It's great. I think it's
Thank
great.
you. Yes, yes. The tides are changing, I
We
feel.
need a voice, and you're our voice. So that's wonderful.
Thank you.